If it wasn't clear enough in previous videos of mine, I love the Metroid series. I think they're some of the greatest games of all time, and I'm always eager for a new installment, or a title with similar concepts from a different developer. I don't think it's that crazy to assume that many people today probably don't even know what the Metroid series is outside of Super Smash Bros. The adventures of Samus Aran have never broken sales records in the way that Nintendo's other big franchises have, despite its influence reaching most corners of the industry. The Metroid series was one of the pioneers for non-linear open-ended exploration, and without it, I think the enormous volume of open-world games that we see today simply would not exist. Before BioShock, before Resident Evil, before even Ocarina of Time, Super Metroid created a believable atmospheric world that was eerie and unsettling. While Metroid itself hasn't had a large presence for the past decade, the indie scene is exploding with games of the same Metroidvania genre. That term wouldn't even have existed if Symphony of the Night hadn't borrowed so many elements from Super Metroid to take the Castlevania series in a bold new direction. To get to the point, I wanted to make a video openly describing all of my love for the Metroid series in the hopes of getting new fans interested, and to open a dialogue about what we want to see in future titles. Even if not speaking on the core Metroid series, I wanted to throw some praise to the countless indie titles like Hollow Knight, Ori and the Blind Forest, and Guacamelee, all of which are fantastic. I can't wait to play Will of the Wisps and finally get around to Guacamelee 2 at some point. Also the Hornet expansion, because don't worry Team Cherry, it's not like I haven't played enough of your near-perfect game already. After Metroid Prime 4 was announced to be undergoing a complete restart of development, it got me thinking about everything I love about the series, and where I hope it goes next. I'm happy to wait for Prime 4's eventual release, especially with Retro Studios coming back, but I do hope they can improve on the existing formula and find new ways to freshen up Samus's rather simple movement. This video is not a full "what is Metroid" to explain to someone who knows nothing about the franchise, just to be completely clear, so some basic knowledge is expected. I'd recommend you watch channels like The Orphean if you just want more content to catch you up with the series' history, and not just my subjective blabbering. Before we start, just to list off some nonsense about myself, I properly got into the series around 2013-2014, and these are all the Metroid games that I've played. I haven't played the spin-offs or the original 8-bit Metroid 1 and 2 all the way through since they're so dated and not really that fun to play. I've never bothered with Other M, but I have also played the fan-made AM2R twice through and I love it. I've read the manga, own a bunch of t-shirts, some official and others fan-made, posters that I still need to put up somewhere, this coaster on my desk, a Figma of Samus in her power suit, and various amiibo, except for that amazing squishy baby Metroid. I'll find you again someday. I generally prefer the 2D games to the 3D Prime series, with Super Metroid as my favorite in the franchise, and one of my favorite games ever, with Zero Mission at a close second. I'm not entirely sure how I'd rank the Prime trilogy, but I'd probably have 1 and 2 at a tie, with 3 a little below the first two, but I'd need to play them all again to properly decide. You can see my original thoughts playing the Prime series on my Twitter if you go back enough. All of the Metroid cast sit in my main character pool in Super Smash Bros., with Ridley currently being my second most played character in Ultimate, just behind Richter. Samus's armor in Super Metroid and Prime 3 is my favorite overall, and I wish they used that look for Smash instead of the Other M armor. Whenever a game has a character creator, I often tend to try and make Samus, but part of that is because she's not exactly a difficult design to get right. I would love to see the series properly adapted into a film someday, either live action or animated, and I think we need to see more of Samus's personality in future titles, without turning her into an objectified, emotionless husk of a character. Okay, I think that's all of the context you need. Without further ado, here's me rambling for a while about the things I love, and the things I think could be done even better about Metroid. This title screen says so much while using so very little. The slow, creepy music, the long panning shots across the dead scientists on the ground, the faint squeaking of the baby Metroid getting more prominent as the music builds and builds before that title hits the screen. We're building mystery and intrigue and the game hasn't even started yet. But when it does...
The last Metroid is in captivity. The galaxy is at peace.
I've always loved how oddly terrifying that line sounds. The Metroid series has such an incredible sense of atmosphere that I will never tire of. Exploring such an open, non-linear, interconnected world is made all the more engaging when it looks, sounds, and feels this good. Somehow these games can be dark and foreboding without being oppressive or outright horrific, although there are times when it gets a bit out there. While I don't rank Fusion as highly as Super and Zero Mission due to its more linear design and odd difficulty, the inclusion of the SAX was pure genius. A representation of Samus at her most powerful state that is hunting you down with cold, dead eyes and loud metallic footsteps as you desperately try not to be seen in your now weakened form. Light horror elements like these are just perfect for these grim alien planets where almost every life form is out for your blood. The first boss of Super Metroid is a fake out of a Chozo statue that normally offers you items, with it instead coming to life and attacking you, eventually having its head ripped off and liquid dripping on the ground. Crocomire's skin melts off and his bones go for one last attack as a semi-jump scare. The stealth sequence at the end of Zero Mission has you navigating a tight, fairly linear sequence of rooms patrolled by space pirates. The gross, veiny design of Dark Samus, and Ridley's build-up at the beginning of Prime 3 before his action-packed boss fight. Metroid does so well at creating a spooky atmosphere with its light use of horror elements, which I feel adds a lot more to the emotional investment of the player and their actions. If there's one thing I will always praise the Prime series for, it was Retro Studios' ability to bring you into Samus's head and see everything the way she does. The first-person perspective makes for some really immersive gameplay, to the point that I've actually played the opening of Prime 1 in VR, and it was pretty surreal. Unfortunately, I don't have any of my own footage to prove that, and it didn't really work that well. The visor effects like the raindrops, mist, splat marks, and others help to maintain the connection between the player and Samus, and just make things more believable and grounded. While we do often tend to think of Samus as this unstoppable bounty hunter, it's important for us to feel vulnerability in her as well. Massive shoutouts to the visor reflections in Prime 3, not only for changing as the game goes on and Samus suffers further corruption from Phazon, but also for tracking her eye positions while using the scan visor. I kinda freaked out when I first noticed that, I thought it was so cool. Honestly, Prime 3 in general looks incredible, especially when playing on Dolphin at 1080p. This charge beam particle effect is simply gorgeous, and Samus's suit has never looked better. Anyway, there's a unique sense of hope underlying all of the dark, creepy stuff in the Metroid series. Something about the music, something about the world, there's always some kind of detail to emphasize Samus's determination, showing that she will not give up. Super Metroid's amazing escape sequence followed by the incredible credits theme always gives me goosebumps, making me feel like a triumphant hero. Gotta be honest, I have a bit of a habit of doing a little salute whenever Samus appears at the end. I just can't help it, even though it's really stupid. Despite her minimal dialogue and in-game personality, I find Samus to be such an endearing protagonist due to her selfless heroism, and her compassion towards even the very creatures she attempted to wipe from existence. The score in general, across the entire series, is just fantastic. I normally like my upbeat, swinging jazz pieces and John Williams-style orchestral melodies, but Metroid's haunting themes have always grabbed me. They aren't just pure, forgettable atmosphere, they have memorable, catchy tunes, but are presented in such sinister ways. There's also the bombastic orchestral arrangements for Samus's theme, and the techno rock sounds in Ridley's boss theme. Massive shoutouts to Kraid's theme, Brinstar Red Soil, Lower Norfair, the surface of SR388, and the Metroid Prime title and menu themes for being some of my favorite music tracks in the entire series. This is all without mentioning the insane attention to detail for the game's environments. While the Prime series is where this is most noticeable, especially with the fantastic addition of optional scan logs for world building, Super Metroid was off to a great start with the amount of diverse alien life and color palettes in each of its major areas. The small creatures crawling on the body of this soldier outside of Kraid's boss room, the ruins of the original Mother Brain encounter of Metroid 1 covered in haze while all the lights are off, and the way most bosses change in color to reflect their current health without a less immersive on-screen health bar. It's no wonder Nintendo isn't churning out Metroid games every year, because the amount of work required to get these games right is absurd. It speaks volumes that Prime 4 had to suffer such a major delay, since the game clearly must not have been up to even Nintendo standards, which probably aren't quite as high as mine. It can be hard to discuss the story of the Metroid series, not just because many people assume that it isn't important, but also because the timeline can be a little wonky thanks to the Prime series sitting in between Metroid 1 and 2, and Other M placed between Super and Fusion. The stories work best with a mix of subtle subtextual stories in the environment, like in many areas of the Prime games, and larger scripted moments like the start and end of Super Metroid. Samus's emotional journey through Metroid 1, 2, Super, and Fusion is something I'd love to see expanded on, but it's getting close to 2 decades since Fusion came out, and that's still the end of the timeline. Seeing Samus save a baby Metroid and form a motherly bond with it, eventually leading to it saving her life not once, but twice, is just really touching. Wait, is it 3 times now if we count Samus Returns? By the end of Fusion, Samus has Metroid DNA in her body, her gunship is gone, and her signature armor was surgically ripped off her body. So what happens next? I want to know. I feel like we may get a Fusion remake from the Samus Returns developers at Mercury Steam sometime soonish, and then we might get lucky enough for a proper sequel sometime after that. But who knows? Just on Switch and not 3DS this time, thanks. Again, while I don't love the linear nature of Fusion, it made for a good story about Samus, and I truly want to see more of that, and done even better. It's all in the details, just the smallest amount of animations can tell so much about this character without distracting from the gameplay that is, and always has been, the highest priority in the Metroid series. The way she kills the other bounty hunters in Prime 3 with such remorse is shown entirely without dialogue, just subtle animations. I'd love it if we got to see more of her outside the armor from time to time, and no, I don't mean in the way you're thinking. Maybe Samus doing work in the ship and upgrading her suit, or just living life outside of her constant missions for the Galactic Federation. Hey, what if we actually got to see her, hunting bounties for once? All of these little things were hinted at in the ending screens for Zero Mission, with Samus at some kind of space bar. And look, I'm not saying I want a full game of Samus mows the lawn, but I'd love to see more of this character's life. Where does she live? Is her gunship a mobile home? Does she still think of her parents? How does she feel about the baby Metroid? What does she do for fun? Does she have any friends? Enemies? Outside of the giant reptilian ones, of course. Prime 3 isn't perfect, but I appreciated its effort to expand the universe and show more of Samus's traditional routine during its opening. As unnecessary as it was, I was giddy to get to push buttons and flip switches to my heart's content in the gunship. I do also understand that Other M attempted to add some of these details, but I like to treat it as non-canon, or at least, not fully canon. For the record, I have no problem with Samus being able to speak either, just not with the lame, emotionless delivery from Other M. Maybe this is the kind of thing that a Metroid film could work on really well, but I still think it could work in a game if handled properly. Perhaps making these kind of details an optional thing you could look at, or focused on mainly in the openings and endings as to avoid dragging down the gameplay in the middle. Samus Returns also hinted at the possibility of an evil race of Chozo for an upcoming title, but that would still probably be before Fusion. There are so many possibilities in regards to creating interesting narratives within this series, and with Samus as our protagonist, and I'd just really like for her mainstream image to be less of that one babe in Smash, and more of the cool, strong hero of the galaxy that I know that also has her own emotional problems to deal with. Just not Ridley-related PTSD when she's already killed him around, 3 or 4 times by now? As another side note, I'd really like if we could retcon the whole magical girl transformation thing going on with her armor in Prime and Other M. I'd much prefer for the armor to feel like a tangible, physical piece of machinery that she needs to wear instead of it just being this nonsensical suit that turns off and on whenever she wants. Because in a series with giant pteranodon dragons who command an army of space pirates to steal jellyfish that can sometimes love a woman raised by big birds, that suit is just far too silly for me. Everything I've just said hasn't really been related to gameplay, so I should probably discuss how much I love playing as Samus and exploring these wonderful worlds. The Metroid series is an exploration first, combat second kind of experience, although most of the power-ups you'll come across are missile expansions to help with bosses and other fights. The gameplay is always at its absolute best when all of the mechanics flow together seamlessly and provide the player a degree of freedom so extreme that they can break the rules once they've mastered everything. Little to no hand-holding either, the player needs to be able to figure out the intended path forward on their own, but with subtle hints provided from the level design. An optional, easy mode that placed waypoints on the map would be fine to have in future games to help those who've never played them before. I'd say almost everyone knows that the Metroid series has an open, non-linear design to its maps, but the best games have maps that are interconnected, and don't just feel like separate levels that have no way of physically linking up. Super Metroid has secret shortcuts and hidden pathways everywhere, while the Prime games, especially Prime 3, are far more segmented. That can still be fun, but it doesn't make the world feel as cohesive and surprising when each area exists in its own little vacuum. This is something many indie Metroidvanias have learnt from, with Hollow Knight's enormous map containing various entrances and exits into its many areas, and offering a great fast travel system. The Super Metroid method of progression that briefly leads you back through old areas on your way somewhere else is perfect, as it means you don't need to halt progression in order to visit an old area and get some more energy tanks and missile expansions. You just do it on the way while you're already heading to the next area. To be honest, I've never even really bothered to get 100% in any of the Metroid games, since there's always one or two items that are too disruptive to my run to go back and get. So I prefer to beat them under the speedrun times and just have fun finding what I can along the way. Hollow Knight though, nah, I gotta get everything. I did 100% Samus Returns when it first came out just for the hell of it, but I haven't again since. I'll be the first to admit that the controls of Samus in Super Metroid aren't really that good. Zero Mission and Fusion have the far better core controls, with a much faster, heavier Samus and a lovely ledge grab, but Super set the standard that unfortunately isn't always followed. A relatively fast ground speed and fantastic wall jump with a basic pea shooter is what Samus starts the adventure with, ending the game with her fleeing off grapple points, shine sparking through walls, nuking rooms with power bombs and screw attacking enemies to bits, and of course having the time spare to save the animals. It's important for a good Metroid game to have a sense of progression, without Samus being completely powerless at the beginning. The wall jump alone is simply genius, a medium to high skill ceiling movement tool that allows a great player to access areas and upgrades earlier than normally intended. This is why Fusion and Samus Returns are somewhat disappointing in terms of progression and movement, since they nerfed the wall jump completely, preventing the ability to scale single walls with relative ease, and make exploration feel like a breeze. Samus Returns does still let you bomb jump, but that's mostly it. The fan-made Another Metroid 2 remake was a treat when I managed this tricky series of wall jumps early in the game to get an item earlier than intended. It's just so damn satisfying. One of the biggest reasons I don't love the Prime series as much as the 2D games is their lack of open-ended exploration tools, focusing more of the combat and 3D puzzle platforming, restricting the player's ability to sequence break or just have fun with the mechanics. The space jump went from this amazing infinite jump to just a double jump. Now, I do understand why this had to be, but this is a design philosophy that stretches through all of Prime. The screw attack can now only hop along straight lines, the grapple beam can only be used when the prompt appears and has no other function, there's no wall jump, the speed booster is just gone entirely, hell, Samus can't even sprint. And look, I get it. The Prime series' focus on slower exploration with puzzle and combat elements was done really well. It's just that backtracking through the map is very time consuming. I do not want to devalue how good these games are, but I do miss that agile, powerful feeling of Samus from the 2D games. Other M did give it a try at least. I'd say the one thing I want most from Prime 4 is a more agile Samus, which would really help for exploring these huge worlds, especially when backtracking. I'm not saying I expect Titanfall 2 levels of movement, although now that I say it, it would be pretty cool. Nor do I expect over-the-top anime action hero Samus, which we've seen brief glimpses of in Other M and Samus Returns, but I'd like the right balance without resorting to either of the extremes. Many item-based games, including the Zelda series, struggle to make their upgrades feel useful without just being situational, while Metroid has often at least attempted to bring some depth to its upgrades. Doesn't always hit the nail on the head though. The various missiles and bombs have widespread combat utility, along with all of the different beams in Prime, but often as simply just differently colored keys for locked doors across the environment. On the other side, the high jump boots, space jump, and screw attack are amazing and kinda speak for themselves. The ice beam is handy for freezing enemies to make platforms or slow them down for easier kills, and the speed booster just makes exploration faster and more entertaining, but those are kind of it. The grapple beam is handy sometimes for collecting items and swinging around those blocks in Meridia, but it's pretty situational. The spider ball is cool, but it's too slow for me to want to use it very often, especially in AM2R where I'd rather wall jump everywhere if possible. I'm not even really saying that this is a bad thing, just that many other Metroidvanias have found ways to make each upgrade feel more meaningful. My mind springs immediately to Guacamelee, where the upgrades double as moves to use in combat and platforming tools. The uppercut has great utility in combat, I mean, it's an uppercut, and can also be used to gain extra verticality and break red blocks that are covering up other areas. Similar things can be said for the game's headbutt, dash punch, and dive moves. Hollow Knight's large focus on bosses means that the amount of combat and weapon-based upgrades is more justified, but the core movement system has a strong amount of utility as is. Not only does the player acquire a wall jump, dash, double jump, and Shine Spark styled super dash, but the nail that you start the game with can be used to pogo off enemies and spikes to explore and sequence break. It obviously has great utility in combat as well, keeping you higher in the air and resetting your double jump after each bounce. Ori and the Blind Forest's bash ability may just be the greatest example I could ever think of. It's insanely useful for movement across the entire game, and is also extremely powerful in combat, allowing you to bounce off different enemies and send their projectiles back at them. You also acquire a throwing orb that you can combo with bash to get creative and do all sorts of crazy stuff. Not only that, but Ori has a double jump, triple jump, feather glide, wall jump, stomp, charge jump, and dash ability. For the Sonic fans here, imagine a Sonic game with that level of movement. In fact, Ori reminds me a lot of what a Sonic Metroidvania could be like. Back on topic, this is the kind of mechanical complexity and all-around usefulness of power-ups that I'd love to see applied across all of the Metroid games. Not that they're devoid of them. Again, the wall jump, speed booster, space jump, screw attack, and honestly even the morph ball are all great, but there's room for improvement. It's also important to remember that Super Metroid came out in 1994 and did a pretty damn great job at making at least some of its upgrades so useful, while all of the examples I listed released some 20 years later, and had that foundation to build from. I think it would be good that I mention some of the great bosses in the series as well. Ridley's made a name for himself appearing in basically every game except for Prime 2, and even finally appearing in Smash. Being the guy who killed Samus's parents, it always feels satisfying to take him down each time he reappears. But I want to talk about all the other bosses in the series. Big, imposing creatures make for a great sense of spectacle, and are perfect for establishing change in the environment or giving the player a great item. Killing Phantoon and restoring power to the wrecked ship, or having bosses themed after their power-ups they give you like in Metroid 2, Fusion, and Prime 2. I feel it's important for these bosses to not only test the player's ability to shoot things, but also their knowledge of the movement tools they've been given. Knowing when to jump, morph ball, wall jump, grapple beam, or space jump, all of these abilities can be tested in unique ways during a boss fight to let the player prove they've mastered them, rather than testing if the player has enough energy tanks to brute force their way through. I for one would love to see some kind of chase boss where you're running after it with the speed booster and need to time a Shine Spark into its weak point. It could even function as a semi-tutorial for Shine Sparking, since most casual players or newcomers wouldn't even know about it. Or maybe we could have a boss themed after the grapple beam, making the player perform a bunch of Spider-Man-like swings up to the higher areas to get a good shot at the boss. We could even incorporate Prime 3's grapple lasso for ripping off pieces of armor and getting closer to its core. I think that the melee counter from Samus Returns was a great idea to add upon Samus's combat potential, but it did become a little one-note and made the enemies far too aggressive. I'd love to see this expanded upon further, perhaps even in Prime 4 with something similar to, and I know this sounds ridiculous, the glory kills in Doom. I know, not that extreme, but some kind of close quarters melee ability could be really fun for the 3D titles as well, especially in first person. I'm just spitballing here. I don't want Samus to be taking on enemies on the level of Bayonetta, but if we're going to have combat and boss fights in this series, I'd like to see the concepts pushed further, especially with modern hardware. Big dramatic boss fights are always a great way to punctuate a moment in the game, not just for Samus, but for the player too. Wrapping up now, I know this video has been a lot of rambling, although I've tried to keep things somewhat structured without rewriting the entire thing. The Metroid series is incredible, but obviously there are still areas that it can improve in, so thankfully this video wasn't nothing but glowing praise because that may come off as a little too one-sided. I wanted this to be one of my shorter videos as well, and, well, I suppose it technically is, but this still turned out to be a little bigger than I anticipated. For the Metroid fans watching, I'm curious as to how you feel about what I said. I didn't talk about everything, and there were some things I probably could have explained better, but I wanted to be as brief as I could while still being in-depth like my other videos. For those who've never played Metroid before, I can only hope that my deep dive, while being very out of context for someone unfamiliar with the series, maybe got you a little more interested on the overall appeal of the series. I'd love to do more on Metroid in future, and maybe more videos like this on other topics. With Bayonetta 3 coming out eventually, I'd like to tackle those games at some point, maybe in a style similar to this. I've also been marathoning the Devil May Cry games before DMC5 comes out, so it's given me a lot more context. Anyway, that's about it from me. University starts back up soon, which means I'm going to vanish again. I'll always keep you posted on Twitter and Discord if you have any questions, or just want to see what I'm up to, but the YouTube uploads are gonna crawl to a halt for a few more months. Thank you all for watching, and go play Super Metroid or something while we wait another few years for Prime 4.